The Alliance for Gun Responsibility, Margot Bennett, against gun violence, are annually affected by this epidemic. And your microphone.
Mass shootings, right? And they
talk a little bit from your perspective of an organization of women.
Include men. Men sit on our board. For us, we have a problem associated with that really hasn't been addressed legislatively. But also started to protect and serve. So we're
injured, and the president at that time, and the Secret Service agent who also was.
I'm so excited about to address
through gun violence as were killed in the entire Second World War. That's just stunning. I also want to note, just in the interest of full disclosure, that one of our really wonderful friends committed suicide through a handgun, and this idea of the Second Amendment, I think, is one that can coexist with safety, but we really do have to change our views of what that means, particularly when you think that 65% of gun deaths are at this intersection of depression and accessibility of guns. So let's talk about the solutions that you each propose. And also, if we can talk a little bit about what's going on right now in terms of the new ATF nominee, some of the proposals that President Biden is advancing through executive action. Maisha, why don't you start off? We're going to go in the reverse direction. Maisha, could you just talk a little bit about how you see America evolving in a way that also recognizes the differences in the regional differences, the differences between rural and urban environments? How do you see this functioning in a way that is respectful of people's interests and lifestyles, but also reduces our 40,000 count considerably?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for that. I think first and foremost, we need to recognize that every single American is impacted by gun violence. And for far too long, we have allowed large organizations and even leaders to divide us. I live in Colorado. I was born in Greeley, Colorado. It's a rural community. And as I've been in my community here in Colorado, I've been to every county, and I've spoken to people about this issue, specifically in urban and rural areas. And the notion that I hear is that it's us versus them. And it's not that. Because no mother, no father, no sister or brother should ever have to bury their loved one due to gun violence. And I love what Renée said, because it's preventable. We can do something about this. Unfortunately, because there is this division, I think it's upon all of us to make sure we bring everyone back together under the understanding that we can advance common sense gun laws, like background checks that are supported by 80% of Americans, like safe storage, to make sure, and also identifying people who are in mental health distress, and making sure that we have the resources to treat people at the local level. And as it relates to community violence, which my brother and his beautiful fiance were impacted by 10 days after they graduated from Colorado State University, were gunned down with assault rifles. And so I think it's also important that we identify what conflict resolution looks like in communities of color. We have seen an uptick in gun violence since COVID because people's mental health is really unstable. Just here in Colorado yesterday, we had 4 deaths. 2 of them were due to road rage, where literally someone pulled up along somebody who got cut off and shot them.
Most people that are committing violence against others have not. And so being very aware that people in crisis are not necessarily diagnosed with mental illness. And in fact, people account for very, very few actual violent acts. So I think that's just a clarification to make as we're and being very
between mental health issues and some limit. A little bit about that. How do we bring this to? We heard about background checks. We heard about a waiting period. What other actions can be taken so that we ameliorate both sides of this equation?
Yeah, I think, my grandmother used to say, you can't change what you're not willing to confront. And I think that we really need to confront what's happening at the community level. And I love what Renee said is that we have hundreds and thousands, she didn't give this number, but we have hundreds and thousands of people who have undiagnosed PTSD and depression. And we have specifically seen this in communities of color and even amongst our veterans. And within that, people don't know how to handle conflict again. And so what we need is an upstream approach. We need to make sure that this is a public health issue, not at just the federal level, but also at the state level. So that when people are experiencing a change in their mental health, when they're unstable, when you are, dealing with not feeling safe in your community, I think we have to acknowledge that there's lots of Black people and brown people and poor people who don't feel safe in their communities. They're afraid for their children to play outside. They're afraid for their children to go to 7-Eleven and get Skittles like Trayvon Martin. And so we have to address how we build safer communities where people feel safe and they don't feel like they need to purchase a weapon, and specifically an assault weapon, to make sure that they feel safe. And then we also have to acknowledge where are our guns coming from? Because the majority of guns that are coming into communities of color are not purchased through our traditional system. They're not going to a gun show. They're not going to Ace Hardware. They are getting guns on a corner. And I've talked to lots of people, specifically after my brother was murdered. And they said, oh, it's easier to get a gun than to get school supplies for my children. And so I think that's another thing that we address. But we have to have both a reactive plan in place, right? And then we also have in public policy, but then we also need to invest in upstream measures like mental health, education, jobs. All of those things play into why people decide to pick up a gun instead of pick up a phone to call someone who could help them move through the difficult situations that we all experience in life.
I think what you're saying is that we have to treat our America as if we're one family, right? If we have a family member who's in distress, we're not going to hesitate about taking away their guns, right? If we have a situation where we see firearms proliferate, we're not going to hesitate about requiring certain limits, right, Margot? I mean, if we start to think not in terms of absolutes, but in terms of family, maybe that's part of the solution here. We just took another poll, and it's interesting. 100%. We never get 100%. Well, we very rarely do. In this particular case, we did. We asked if actions that decrease gun injuries and deaths impinge on Second Amendment rights, are people willing or unwilling to compromise Second Amendment rights? 100% of the people, even the people who didn't feel that we have a gun problem, even those people in this particular poll felt that they are willing to compromise in some way. And maybe that's the key, Margot. Is it a matter of just sort of compromising and listening to each other as if we're one family?
Well, I feel like the gun violence prevention movement has been compromising a lot over the years. I'm not sure I'm still willing to compromise that much. I think we have repeatedly watered down important legislation to appeal to the politicians that won't acknowledge what's going on. But I also want to say I'm a little uncomfortable with all the discussion on mental illness, because a lot of people own guns, treat them carelessly, leave them out, loaded, not locked up. There are so many unintentional shootings in the home. Children bring those guns to school. That's not a mental health issue. That's a responsible gun owner not being as responsible as they think they are. And so I think we really need to think about safe gun storage. That's really one of our front burner projects.
Why
But
is
I also think we need to consider serious consequences when people don't. I think when something horrible happens with an unsecured gun and everybody talks about it, it's such a tragedy, and the people who left the gun out shouldn't be punished. They're already suffering enough. I think we need to have some serious repercussions. I just don't know how to get responsible gun owners to be responsible without that.
When you look at the statistics, it's really interesting. Just look at the Wikipedia page, and what you find is that there are 120 guns per 100 people in the United States. And if you look at Yemen, which is a country at war, it's 52 per 100, right? New Caledonia has 42, Montenegro, Serbia. These are all hotspots in which gun ownership is a third or quarter of our gun ownership. Renee, would you care to comment on what Margot was saying about, it's enough with compromise? We really need to move very, very aggressively toward winning, either in the courts or in the regulatory battles or in executive actions, in terms of reducing availability of guns. Let's regulate. Let's require licensing. Let's increase penalties. How do you see your approach on this?
Well, I think it's important. I think maybe Maisha said this earlier, that people want to treat gun violence prevention or the gun issue as an us and them, as a yes or no. And that is not how the American people feel. And the bottom line is we need to be electing people who actually represent what their constituents want and demand. And I think that's an approach we've taken in Washington State. We have flipped seats from people who are steadfast, married to the gun lobby, and replaced those people with people who are gun violence prevention champions. And that, I think it's absolutely important for Americans to understand that we have the ability to do that. We have the power to do that. And like Margot said earlier, voting suppression is a huge issue that we have to be fighting against. Gerrymandering, a huge issue that we have to be fighting against, because we need to have elected officials that actually represent the will of the people that they're elected to serve. And right now, that is not the case. It is absolutely not the case. We also need to understand and change culture in America in terms of education, that a gun makes you safer, because it does not. All research shows that having a gun in your home makes you much more susceptible to all kinds of gun violence, unintentional, domestic violence, suicide. Every single kind of gun violence you are more susceptible to if you own a gun in your home. They do not make you safer. So I think back to your point, Mark, about the sheer number of guns that we have in the United States. It is a huge problem, and there are ways to own guns more safely. There are ways to mitigate the danger that they bring into your home. And I think we've already talked about some of those: safe storage, waiting periods, background checks, et cetera. But this, again, this us and them is not where the American people are.
We're coming to the end of our time, so Margot, I'm gonna give you a word, and Maisha will exit with you. Margot, go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to add to what Renee was saying, and this is a public health epidemic. It's no different than COVID. We acted quickly, we acted assertively, we didn't compromise in our efforts. We moved forward to get it under control and to suppress the virus. And that's what we need to do with guns and gun violence.
Maisha, could you see us out with the last word? In your view, what do we have to do?
Yeah, I just want to again say thank you for being invited here. It was great to meet Margot and Renee and you as well, Mark. Again, I just think that, this is a public health issue of our time. This is if COVID wasn't here, this would be the number one epidemic that we are facing in the United States of America in every single state. And so just like when we think about what's required to drive a car, we need those same provisions around gun ownership. People should have to have a license. They should have to go through training. They should be required to be responsible gun owners, as Margot said. And then they should be held responsible and accountable if their gun is stolen and used in a crime. No different than driving a motor vehicle, which is also a lethal weapon. We have the potential to do this. When we fight, we win, and we are winning. For the first time ever, we have a Congress, we have a Senate, and we have a White House who at least hear us. They take our phone calls. They feel our pressure and they want to do something. So let's not let up. Let's continue to lean in and do the good work that we need to do to end gun violence within our lifetime.
I'd like to thank you all for contributing to this discussion. My own opinion here is that there are two factors. First of all, we have to talk to each other, and we have to treat each other like family. A gun is a dangerous piece of equipment. If you're handling a dangerous piece of equipment, you have to be knowledgeable about it. You have to take safety precautions. You are held responsible for the damage that dangerous piece of equipment causes. If we just treat each other as if we are family members, and if a family member is in crisis, we take away their guns, right? If we just deal with that sort of common sense approach. If we just did that, we would be able to protect everyone's rights and reduce the number of deaths, the number of injuries every year. And that's just a start. It's just a very, very sort of common sense approach. And you've all advanced those approaches. I would hope that we're able to reach the vast majority of Congress people, of senators to help pass these common sense regulations. Thank you so much for sharing your work with us. Renée Hopkins, CEO of the Alliance for Gun Responsibility, Margot Bennett, Executive Director of Women Against Gun Violence, and Maisha Fields, Vice President of Organizing for the Brady Campaign to Prevent Gun Violence. That's the nonprofit report. Everybody stay safe, mask up, and we'll see you next Tuesday. Take care.